Chaim prògram So Here I Am, 100 Years of Crofting, a chraoladh an thoiseach at BBC a fhearann, an an Ceud h-oidhirpean. Hu can sgrìobhadair Seumas Mac in Halagar, sùil Croitearach an an Alba, Ceud bliadhna strì Croitearan Bhràigh as Eilean Sgitheanach, as an sealbh ad an dhearan ac a fhein. Gheur in aimhreiteach mion-sgrùdadh deach Croitearan as an náisiúneach. Agus an noch Ceud h-oidhirpean gainich Croitearan cóirichin fhearann Croitearan an a lug. Chaidh So Here I Am in h-imhreitean as an t-Sealgair fhearann a gainich gan Croitearan van Oorsen. Ceud bliadhna strì Bhràigh, chaidh So Here I Am in h-oidhirpean as an t-Sealgair fhearann a gainich agus croitearachd a lesachig. Wanna chaim prògram a chraoladh cóir deach blana fichidadash ha an holamh mac an chalagad et clú a chosnug mar haar geoliche ed jachtri na geeltocht na Eilean. Be a studiche ed unit jachtri olhé na geeltocht agus na Eilean, agus haid mór an leorich in a sgrìobhadair min a sgìobhadair. Ach haid a bhí tríbal am a methe foploch na geeltocht cúteoch. Ans na hochgatan be a studiche ed unig na Croitearan, Inis catrachas croitearach na Alba, agus adar na Ceud nach a hoch, agus dávílas a céir, van a chariche ed immert na geeltochs na Eilean. Ha mac an chalagad inis ed ligaliehe griach, agus a fidach fascad a vanachin. How did So Here I Am come about in the first place?
Well, it was conceived, I think, to mark the 100th anniversary, the centenary of the Battle of the Bhràigh in Skye. And that was a key event in getting the land agitation going and the movement that became the Highland Land League and eventually was successful in delivering the 1886 Crofters Act and giving crofters security of tenure and thereby bringing the clearances to an end. So it was really to mark the 100th anniversary of that event. And I think the reason I got involved in it was that I'd written just a few years before a book called The Making of the Crofting Community, and which was actually more or less my PhD thesis from Edinburgh University. And at that time, though there was a little bit written about the Highland clearances, there had been nothing at all written about the land agitation and the Land League and indeed the land raids after the First World War and all that sort of stuff. So I was, insofar as there was a historical authority on the whole topic, I suppose it was me, and I think that was how I got involved.
Did you find it difficult in any way telling that story through the medium of television?
No, I think it was good to do. I enjoyed doing it. When you look at the programme now, you realise it was done, or most of it was filmed in April, I think, that year. And the weather was actually very cold. There's often, if you look at the background, you'll see a lot of snow in the hills, and we're all looking sometimes pretty wet and miserable. But it was good to do. And of course, in the making of it, there were various people interviewed that were really good to spend time with, and particularly people like Sorley MacLean, who I interviewed myself on Rassie and indeed in Bhràigh and Skye. He was living in Bhràigh at that time, but of course he came from Rassie, and of course he was steeped in the significance of all of this and could speak about the history anyway with real authority. And then there's, I think, in some ways the most significant bit of the programme, if you think of it now as a kind of historical document, if you like, is the interview with Angus Macaulay. And Angus had actually himself been one of the land raiders just after the First World War, back from the army, back from the war, and taking the land illegally that had been promised to them but not delivered by the government of the day at that time. And I think to hear and see a man like that who had done these things and could speak about it from personal memory is tremendous, because of course there's nobody now who can do that.
Well, thanks for the moment, Jim. Coimisean Mac the Seumas Mac in Ceilbh mú croitearachd dèich, ach an thoiseach seo corm, so here I am, 100 years of crofting in dèich.
There was a seer over in Lewis that predicted that all these highlands would be left to the chraoladh goose and nobody living. That was about 100 or maybe 200 years ago. And it seems to be working that way. It seems to be working that way, that people are leaving.
Angus Macaulay is one of Scotland's 8,000 crofters. His few acres here in North Uist and the Outer Hebrides had to be fought for, and now, after all his struggles, he fears his fields might still revert to the chraoladh goose. Such fears are understandable, but though the crofting way of life is hard and unromantic, the stake in the land has kept crofters and their families in places that would otherwise be deserted. And among the younger people of the crofting townships, there are clear signs of a new determination to keep crofting in existence.
Everybody gets tempted to leave at some time or another. I think it's when things start going wrong. If you've had a bad winter, if you could, even it could be a week or a couple of days when things start going wrong, you get fed up and want to go. But I see more people coming back now. You know, they greater go to the bright lights of the city, but quite a lot of people now are getting fed up with that and want to get back to the islands again.
I think there is a certain bond between Croft and this land. The bond is probably something which you could trace quite far back into the past, where people had to really fight for the land, you could say. The fact that they had to work so hard for it has probably created this bond.
Sometimes I wish that Highlanders living in the south had the same sense of mission as the Jews who went back to Palestine after 1916, and who made a go of tilling the land, rebuilding the economy. But, you know, there were obvious differences there. Circumstances were different, but in most cases I would say young people on the mainland do want to come back.
Once these localities were thickly populated, but the folk who lived here were in their landlord's way. In the first half of the 19th century there was more money in sheep than in people, and so the people had to go. In glen after glen, on island after island, whole communities were destroyed to make way for the big sheep farms that made Highland landlords wealthy men. What happened here in Bhràigh was typical of what went on throughout the Highlands. These ruins at sgrìobhadair remain grim monuments to the Highland clearances, to the burnings, the expulsions and evictions, which so many Scots still find so tragic and so unforgivable. From here were forcibly expelled the forebears of Gaelic poet Sorley MacLean. In him and in his poetry, the sadness and the anger linger still.
Arachgrich agus cóine, gulas, miras fulangas, ferregas fua agus gaulas, traindas, galtas, bristu cria, agus uarin da honnas cúvesh, grich bet lagel, Maragat castal rochir mandat at tuas grepetals na fhearann agus halag agus gach balag en a ceirdiú qua fás ga agad tréni agus agad eich cynnig. My MacLean great-great-grandfather had at least 3 brothers, Neil, Hector, and Callum, and all their sons went abroad, mostly to Prince Edward Island. One sister or a niece remained in Rossi, married to one of the MacLeods, near whose graves we are standing. Now, between 1852 and 1854, Rainey cleared 12 or 14 townships along the south and east, and 1 or 2 on the west of Rossi. Now, most of the people cleared in the 50s went to Australia, and according to the testimony of the minister of the time, by far the greatest number went against their will. I have heard a lieutenant of the Glasgow police tell how one of his ancestors fled to the hills to escape going. And that lieutenant of the Glasgow police said, "I've been a Bolshevik ever since." Of course, it is well known that some of them, especially women, came and plucked grass and bits of earth from the graves of their people, and that the crying of the women could be heard over in Bhràigh.
The women wept as they were forced on board the emigrant ships, and family traditions of such happenings were the only way that Highland people kept a grip on their own history. Robert MacDonald, from the Skye Crofting district of Valtos, and now a history teacher at the local school, was one of the many who found their community's past ignored by the educational system.
The knowledge that I acquired about the crofter struggle in the 1880s and the Highland clearances, for example, came not so much from a study of history, but through study of Gaelic at higher level, by reading poetry, by reading prose works in Gaelic, not in history, because the higher syllabus in history is devoted more to what I call establishment history, British history, European history, the wider context. And even to this day, the amount of Scottish history within, for example, the higher syllabus is appalling.
There's maybe 3 factors. There's the history, which runs very deep. There's the attachment to the land, which is largely a product of the history, and there's the language. Now, if you look what the education system has done here, how it's treated these 3 factors, then you begin to understand what's wrong with the crofting areas today. Because in terms of the land and agriculture, it's completely ignored by the educational system and is thereby downgraded in the eyes of the people who go through the education system.
Broken and demoralised by the Highland clearances, crofters needed new leaders. Leaders to replace the old clan chiefs who'd become landlords, betraying and evicting their own people. And eventually, new leaders did emerge. Men like John Murdoch, radical, socialist and land reformer. Throughout the 1870s, Murdoch's newspaper, The Highlander, campaigned endlessly against landlordism and urged Scotland's crofters to follow the example of their counterparts in Ireland, where a people in a similar plight had taken militant action on their own behalf.
We labour to form an opinion in this country in favour of the restoration of the land to the people. We believe that every act of violence is against the cause which it is intended to promote. But we know that we can be answered with the statement that violence succeeds where reason fails, that the Irish who strike terror have measures passed for them which the quiet, supplicating Highlanders cannot get.
In the Highlands, too, quiet supplication was about to be abandoned in favour of violence. There had been earlier acts of protest. Now there was to be concerted action against Highland landlords. That action started in the early 1880s in the Skye Crofting district of Bhràigh. Among the lands lost during the clearances were these hill grazings on Benlee, just above the crofts at Bhràigh. These grazings had been very vital to the Bhràigh crofters. But in 1865, during the clearances, the grazings were taken away from the crofters of Bhràigh and added to a sheep farm by their landlord, Lord MacDonald. That left the Bhràigh crofters with nothing but the narrow strips of land running from their houses down towards the sea. That was the common situation in the Highlands. A lot of people lost such lands. What was different about Bhràigh was that in 1881, the crofters here decided to do something positive about getting their grazings back again. That summer, the Bhràigh men had been at the fishing in Kinsale in southwest Ireland. There they'd seen something of the achievements of the Irish Land League, led by nationalist politicians like Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell. In November 1881, not long after the British government had backed down in Ireland and given new security to Irish tenants, the Bhràigh crofters marched into Portree and told Lord MacDonald's factor that they'd pay no rent until the Benlee grazings were returned to them. Lord MacDonald responded to the Bhràigh crofters' demands in the traditional landlord manner. He decided to evict them. At the beginning of April 1882, a sheriff officer set off from Portree with eviction notices to serve on the tenants here at Bhràigh. Not far from this spot, he was met by a crowd of crofters, and the eviction notices were taken from him and burned. The Bhràigh crofters had now committed a crime, and this gave to Sheriff William Ivory, Sheriff of Inverness-shire, the excuse he had been waiting for to move in force against the crofters here at Bhràigh. Ivory assembled a force of about 50 policemen from Glasgow at Portree, and on the morning of 19th April 1882, just as dawn was breaking, these policemen marched past here down the road into Bhràigh. There they arrested the 5 men whom the authorities alleged to be the ringleaders of the crofters' revolt. Meanwhile, the Bhràigh people gathered at a strategically chosen spot where the Portree road threads a narrow gap between hill and sea. The aim was to prevent the police withdrawing with their prisoners. The police made several baton charges. Crofters and their wives responded by pelting the bedraggled constables with jagged rocks and stones. For a moment it looked as though the crowd would be victorious, but one final vicious charge took the police clean through the encircling crofters. Watched by the 2 newspaper reporters who were to make Bhràigh a national issue, Sheriff Ivory and his men retreated back to Portree. Such were the events which passed into history and legend as the Battle of the Bhràigh. Its immediate effect was to draw the crofters' case very much to the attention of people in the south. Soon Skye was swarming with journalists. Questions were being asked in Parliament, and for the first time in 100 years, Highland landlords were under attack. The example set at Bhràigh was quickly followed in other parts of northern Scotland. As violence flared in several localities, the government set up a royal commission to examine crofters' grievances. The Royal Commission began its sittings at the church here in Bhràigh in May 1883. The first witness called by the Commission was a Bhràigh crofter by the name of Angus Stewart. He began by asking for an assurance that he wouldn't be evicted because of what he said. He was asked why he wanted such an assurance.
I cannot testify to the distress of my people without testifying to the oppression and high-handedness of the landlord and his factor.
The commissioners were to hear lots more such evidence in the months ahead throughout the Highlands. Donald Martin, a crofter at Beck on the island of Lewis, summed up for the Commission the feelings of crofters everywhere.
We see the land which our fathers brought under cultivation put under farmers, and ourselves heaped upon one another, upon small patches of the very worst portions of the land, and many without any land at all. Now, insofar as I can understand the mind of the people, I fear there is a danger that they may rise, as the clans of old rose, if they don't get a hold over the land of which they are deprived. If some will say it is not right that we should be seeking these things, I shall not regard these as the poor man's friend. For if it is unlawful for us to ask it now, it was quite as unlawful for them to deprive us of it formerly.
The rising that Donald Martin had foretold wasn't long in coming. The Royal Commission backed reform, but the government was reluctant to challenge the Highlands' politically powerful landlords. Soon violence had erupted once again. In Skye, Tiree, Barra, Lewis and the Uists, lands were seized and held illegally. Rent strikes became universal. In the Skye district of Staffin, the police were authorised to carry guns. But still the crofters were defiant. And in November 1884, a gunboat, a troopship, and 300 Royal Marines were sent to Staffin. The troops remained in northwest Scotland for the next 3 years. Both in Skye and in Lewis there were several violent and bloody confrontations between the army and the crofters, when the Riot Act had to be read in Gaelic, and when heavily armed soldiers battled with intensely hostile crowds. Now the crofters' struggle took on a new political dimension. A Highland Land League, modelled on its Irish predecessor, was established. The Land League's local leaders were determined men. Crofters like John Macpherson from Glendale and Norman Stewart from Valtos, where Stewart was known, significantly enough, by the nickname of Purnell. Soon, almost every crofter was a Land League member, and Norman Stewart and John Macpherson were addressing mass meetings and organising rent strikes, land raids and demonstrations. Constitutional change at Westminster now gave crofters the vote for the first time, and in 1885 the Highland Land League swamped their pro-landlord rivals at the polls. With crofter MPs now in Parliament, the Land League newspaper, the Oban Times, was understandably jubilant.
The enemy have left the spoils and fled before the conquering hosts of land reform. From the Mull of Kintyre to the Butt of Lewis, the land is before us.
In the face of such pressure, the government capitulated. In 1886 there was passed a Crofters Act. Security of tenure was guaranteed, and the Highland clearances brought to an end. Now a crofter could improve his home in the sure knowledge that his landlord couldn't take it from him. More modern houses began to be built on many crofts. So at last things were improving. But though the evictions had ended, their effects were still to be seen. Most of the land lost during the clearances had still to be won back for crofting. It was that land which was promised to the many young Highlanders who volunteered for the armed forces in the Great War that began in 1914. Many were to die before the politicians' word could be put to the test.
After the First World War, when the young people who'd survived the conflict came home, they expected to get the lands that they'd been promised on being recruited. But that promise wasn't kept. Here at Ferns in Rassay, some of the people from Rona, descendants of families evicted in the clearances 60 or 70 years before, came back from Rona here to Ferns and seized these lands behind me. The same sort of thing was happening elsewhere in Skye, in Lewis, in the Uists.
Most of these boys that went away first to the war, they were called up in 1914. I wasn't among them. I wasn't at age at the time. They were called up, and most of the young boys from all round here was called up, and well, things weren't going so bad. Well, they got stuck in Flanders, you know, when the French war started. They were holding their own then, but Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister at the time, thought different, I suppose, and they wanted to recruit all the soldiers they could. And, well, his representatives or the officers of the army came up and held meetings around here, and if you wanted land, you'll get as much land as you want to after the war is over. And the bill is just going through Parliament, and it went through Parliament. If you wanted land after you came back from the war, just apply for it. Well, and it's still on the statute book down in Westminster. And our MP at the time was Dr. Murray. And there was a general election on at the time too, when we came home. And Dr. Murray was up here having one of his meetings, and we approached him and told him that we got no response to our application from Edinburgh or from anybody else. Oh, well, he says, boys, I'm telling you, if you don't raid that land, you'll never get it. Well, that's exactly what we needed, a little bit of a boost, as you know. So next day, we got the piper who was still living up in Bhràigh here, Lord Seumas MacDonald, and he headed us over from Ballamore, and I think up at this house here, which is partly broken down now, up at that house there, that's why we congregated round there. And what are we going to do? Well, no, we'll go up and tell Captain MacDonald's raiding and taking possession of Bhràigh.
With similar scenes being enacted in many crofting communities, a nervous Scottish office finally capitulated. After 16 days in jail, Angus Macaulay and his fellow raiders in North Uist won the land they'd seized. That's why an island like North Uist still has a crofting population today, and why many of its young people can carry on the crofting tradition.
The land that I am working on here, along with my father and my uncle, extends to about roughly 300 acres, and this is 5 crofts plus the total share in the common grazings. That is excluding the hill grazings. I think in Uist at the moment, the tendency is towards larger units. On the island of Ballasher, there's hardly anybody without about 2 crofts or so. So the tendency is towards larger units, and I think that at the moment one person would really need, in acreage terms, probably 150 to 200 acres to make a living of it.
North Uist is comparatively fertile. Here in Skye the crofts are smaller, the land harder. But here too the attachment to the land was just as strong, the struggle to regain possession of it just as great. And by the early 1920s that struggle was being won. In every corner of the Hebrides, men like Angus Macaulay were taking back land lost to crofting during the clearances of 100 years before. But the crofting population had been decimated. With their owners under pressure from land raiders, many estates were purchased by the government in the 1920s, and their crofters became tenants of the Department of Agriculture. But their position was still far from easy. So was it all a hollow victory, or, as some believe, a significant success?
On a long-term view, perhaps it was, because here we are, sitting on what was once a big farm and was cut up into crofting, and here we are prospering. We'd have all been overseas if that hadn't happened. But there was a very bad patch in the 20s. I think they went in on too high. The department made them pay too much going in. And then, of course, everything slumped. We had Wall Street collapsing in 1929. In the 30s, it was very like this time when the government was determined to cut on everything, and the money simply wasn't there, and prices collapsed, you see.
Recession was followed by the Second World War, and in the more affluent Britain of the 1950s, this sort of struggle to improve a barren landscape was clearly not enough to guarantee the crofting future. Another government inquiry, the Taylor Commission, looked at crofting. A permanent crofters commission was set up in the mid-1950s. Then, 10 years later, a seemingly powerful economic agency was created, the Highlands and Islands Development Board. The crofting areas, it was thought, were at last to get the jobs and opportunities they so badly needed. But have these bodies tried to work with crofters and to learn from their history? Among the critics of officialdom is Margaret Macpherson, a dissenting crofter member of the 1950s Taylor Commission.
Well, the first thing was, well, partly it was the mistake of the inquiry, because crofters could assign their croft to their heirs, to their sons or their wives or anybody like that. But the Crofters Commission, in its wisdom, said they could assign to anybody. Now, that was a fatal mistake, because you bring the money into it. They're going to assign to the person who can give them the most money. No word of how the land is being managed, nothing at all about that. Now, that was a very bad mistake, and it was our fault, and I didn't see it at the time.
The Crofters Commission, it seems to me, a kind of curious body. It's there to administer the legalistic bureaucracy of crofting, but without any real creative input to it. And it seems to me pretty well to be superfluous.
Like John Murdoch's Highlander of a century ago, Brian Wilson's newspaper, the West Highland Free Press, has been a constant critic of the way official agencies respond to crofters' needs and aspirations. The paper, published in Skye, is sold right across the crofting areas, and its readership of upwards of 25,000 testifies to the need for an alternative to the established view of Highland problems.
I've always seen the role of the West Highland Free Press more as to articulate what's there already than to impose any sort of ideas. But I think what is always unrecognised in the crofting areas is just how much thinking does go on, how many ideas there are floating about. But inevitably, after this period of time, there's a sense of despair, sense of cynicism, because they have seen for so long the ideas within the community being overruled by ideas and assumptions from out with the community. So I think, and I suspect it would be the same in Murdoch's time, at the time of the agitation, that what was needed was a forum in which the views which are being expressed in everyday conversation, that they were given currency in the public prints. And if the Free Press can contribute to that process, then that is important.
The Free Press led the campaign against the Crofting Reform Act of 1976, an act designed to encourage crofters to buy their holdings. If crofts could be bought and sold just like any other piece of property, the argument went, then it was only a matter of time before the crofting system and the social cohesion that goes with it would break down. To those who agreed with the Free Press, the new act was no answer.
What a solution, ridiculous. And fortunately the crofters are too wise to take advantage of it. But there have been some, of course, but not very many, really, because it would be absolutely the end of crofting if you can bring in people here, there, and everywhere. But even as it is, the crofters are being moved by money, and they're selling it to the richest person. And many a young man in the Skye at this moment is looking for a croft and can't get one because of this. Money is paramount.
The Highlands and Islands Development Board has poured a lot of money into the crofting areas, mainly into tourism. But little has been done to assist the working crofter. The belief persists that an incomer with a fancy scheme for a tourist development or an away-from-it-all industrial project of dubious wisdom will stand a far better chance of obtaining Highland Board assistance than those local people whose modest aim is to improve the viability of a livelihood based on crofting.
The HIDBs, you think, also, but it's never really understood what crofting communities were about. And it has sought to impose conventional 9-to-5 development techniques upon communities which are essentially pluralistic in their economy. I mean, a far, far superior sort of economy, far superior kind of society in which people do various things according to the time, according to the season. They have a varied life, they have a rich life, and a life lived at their own pace. Now that is something which only very recently has the HIDB made any sort of gesture towards with the introduction of community cooperatives.
The former Land League stronghold of Staffin is still one of the strongest crofting areas in Skye, but it faces the perennial problem of crofting communities. There isn't enough additional work around to make crofting viable or attractive. The young people leave, the houses are bought up as holiday homes. The burdens of the crofting system become more difficult for an ageing population to sustain. But in Staffin as elsewhere, there is a deep conviction that this ruthless cycle must be broken, and a growing feeling that the only people who are going to break it are those who have enough commitment to the place to actually live and work there, in spite of all the difficulties. Faced by the failure of its earlier strategy, the Highland Board is now supporting community cooperatives, grassroots ventures which provide remote communities with a new way forward. In Staffin, people are pooling their sparse resources to back their own ideas about what might be done to boost the area's prospects. A sale of work helps raise the cash that's needed for a whole variety of projects.
Is that one of the ships you found lying on the roadside?
Aye, that's it.
Listen, are you selling it?
Yes, of course.
Well, I'll take that bit.
Very good, Missy, very good.
We're going to have a craft shop starting off, and we're going to have agricultural supplies and get the crofting back as much as possible. That's been in limbo quite a lot, I think, recently, but we're hoping it will become lively again. We hadn't really thought about a cooperative when we set out. We were hoping for a hall get a hall for the area, and we're hoping to use that as our base and have a tea room and a craft centre there. And we think we'll be able to give a certain amount of employment.
It's early days for community cooperatives, but the possibilities are exciting. If a few dozen jobs could be provided in this way in each crofting area, then these fragile economies would be transformed. And the cooperatives offer crofting communities the chance to participate directly in the development of fish farming and other local resources. One of the most promising community cooperatives, the Gaelic word is Cohoman, is in the Park area of Lewis, at the centre of last century's confrontation between crofters and their landlords. A couple of years ago, its future was bleak, with a rapidly declining population and little real evidence that official development policy was bringing any benefit. Today, the community cooperative offers hope.
Traditionally, this is a fishing community, it's a weaving community, and while these industries were going well, people really didn't need to look around and examine what other potential there was. But when the cooperative was set up and they had a look at knitwear, this was a skill that was always in the community. It was a resource that was latent within the economic structure of the community, which, when activated and organised, proved capable of earning over £10,000 in the export market. In fish farming, we have found the potential to be excellent in rainbow trout and in turbot, which we're also conducting on an experimental basis. We have now got to the stage here where we're producing more than the island itself is capable of consuming, so we have to expand our marketing activities onto the mainland. I think it's becoming apparent now that there are one or two people coming back who had left the area many years ago and who can visualise for themselves a fulfilled life here within the crofting pattern of living that we enjoy here.
Like the Land League of the 1880s, the community cooperative concept was imported from the Gaelic-speaking areas of Ireland, where it's been applied with great success. Its main advocate there, Father James McDyer of Coincolumkill in Donegal, summed up the philosophy behind it when he said, "Better to light one candle than to forever curse the darkness." In the crofting communities today, there is more than one candle. The common market is poised to invest £20 million in crofting agriculture, though only in the Western Isles. Alongside the growth of interest in cooperatives, there is a revived commitment to the Gaelic language. There is a slow but steady return of people who left their home communities for a world that was supposed to be brighter and better. There is mounting hostility to official policies which have so long concentrated on the problems, not the possibilities, of the crofting life.
A lot has changed since the dramatic events of 100 years ago over there at Bhràigh. Other things are very much the same. Crofting communities are still very remote from government and from the centre of things, and the future of these communities lies still very much with the people who live in them. Because if crofting history teaches anything, it is that no one is going to save crofting except crofters themselves.
Well, I think this crofting is on a knife edge now. It's had so much to stand up to. But I do think it could perhaps be saved, and if young men were putting their energies into it, I think it could be saved. But I'm no prophet, and perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps it'll disappear. But if it does disappear, it'll be a great pity, a very great pity indeed. It shows you another sort of society from the one we have, where everybody's trying to get everything for himself. It's an unselfish sort of society.
So lead me to the river, blood runs thicker than water. Oh, I do believe dust will turn the sea home.
It's a nice place to live. I mean, there's no real pressures on you. You just, being self-employed, you work when you want to, more or less. You don't have a boss. You if you're keen, you just work and you make a go of it. You can make a living if you're willing to work hard enough.
Wrap me in your sheets together, where my earth heart lies forever. Oh, I do believe dust will turn the sea home.
These are not kind of desolate peripheral communities with which nothing can be done. These are communities which can give to young people a far, far better kind of future, a far better form of life than the baubles that are held up to them by a materialistic society.
I've lived my life here with the others. I long to live with you, my brothers. Oh, I do believe dust will turn the sea home.
There is an unmistakable resurgence of self-confidence among Gaelic communities, and in general a very, very definite feeling that the Gael and his language are not down and out.
And my drum will beat this day, pounding for a Gael. Oh, I do believe dust will turn the sea home.
It's your head in the block if things go wrong, but the other way, if you do make a success of it, the success is yours. And it's not part of the success of a large corporation or company.
An empty size, all hands unite in the spring that lies behind the sorrow. Oh, I do believe dust will turn the sea home.
Well, I don't know. After I came over here from Ballamore there, my dad and my mother and my sister came over with me after I built this house. And then I had an uncle emigrating to Canada. So I went over to Canada with him, left the whole thing behind me like that, you know, but I was over there for 5 years, and eventually I came back. I don't know why, and I was going to go back again to Canada, but I never did. So here I am.
Oh, deep the faith and pure the light, that shines inside and guides your people. Oh, I do believe dust will turn to sea home. I do believe dust will turn to sea home. I do believe that dust will turn to sea home. I do believe that dust will turn to sea home. I do believe dust will turn to sea home. I do believe that dust will turn to sea home.
Well, how does it feel to look at yourself as you were over 30 years ago?
Well, in some ways it feels quite alarming when you see yourself as you were all these decades ago. And I think from the point of view of some of the younger members of my family, I think it's all quite hilarious that the amount of facial hair that I possessed then and no longer possess, and indeed much less hair altogether. So it's you have kind of mixed feelings about it.
Not long after the programme was made, you became the first director of the newly formed Scottish Crofters Union. What were your aims for the union?
I remember when I was being asked to take on the job of director of the Crofters Union, I was reluctant for various reasons, and one was that I felt I didn't really know. I knew about the history of crofting and all of that, but I didn't really know about the day-to-day practicalities of crofting. And I remember saying to somebody I had an awful lot of time for and who was very influential in all of this, the late Roddy Steele from South Uist. I remember saying to Roddy, "Look, Roddy," I said, I don't even know. I wouldn't know a gimmer from a cast yow. And I remember Roddy saying, well, he said, "We're not employing you to tell us that." He said, "I think we know that already. We're employing you for other reasons, and we think you'll do a reasonable job on the political front, as it were." So that was that was kind of reassuring. But I had an awful lot to learn about the day-to-day intricacies of crofting and the politics of crofting and the subsidy regimes and all of that. When the union was set up, we were very, very keen, and this may sound paradoxical in view of things that have happened since, we were very keen not to get involved in issues like land reform. I had discovered when I travelled around the crofting area that what crofters really wanted and felt they needed was an organisation which would deal with the nitty-gritty day-to-day issues of crofting. And there was no such organisation at that time. And so we were focused very, very firmly on these matters. And we had, I think, quite a lot of success. I would say we had, in fact, a great deal of success in creating a union that had a membership eventually of between 4,000 and 5,000 people.
In your own opinion, what's been the most important development in crofting since the programme was broadcast?
Well, the most important development in the crofting areas since that time, of course, has been the then totally unforeseen proliferation of community ownership of land. And much of the land, there's 500,000 acres now in community ownership or more, and much of that land is in crofting tenure. Now, when that programme was made, that would have seemed just a fantasy. You know, if you'd said to somebody in 1982 that within, within 30 or so years, this huge area of land in the Highlands and Islands is going to be owned by the people living on it, nobody would have believed that. So that's an extraordinary development. However, it doesn't, it does affect crofting and crofters, but of itself, it hasn't changed fundamentally the nature of the difficulties facing crofting and crofting agriculture in particular. And these difficulties, some of them highlighted in the programme, continue down to the present and in some ways have got more acute. For instance, Margaret Macpherson spoke about what she called the money coming in, and she spoke about how crofts were beginning to change hands for comparatively large sums of cash and how young people in the locality as a result couldn't afford to get into crofting. And that's continued and obviously in a sense has got worse, and it continues to be a real issue.
What would be your own blueprint for the survival of crofting?
I have a kind of iconoclastic view about this. I think that the legislation, though it has protected crofting, and of course if it hadn't been put in place, the beginnings of it put in place way back in the 1880s, there wouldn't be any crofting. But nevertheless, I think that successive governments have added new acts, new bills, new procedures, and the thing has become so incredibly complicated that I think it has outlived its usefulness. I think it's just become far, far too complex. So on top of what are a comparatively small number of people involved in crofting, they have to contend with this vast mass of legislation and regulation. I think the time has come to scrap the whole lot and take a clean sheet of paper, as it were, go back to the beginning and look at the needs of crofting today, not be focused on the legislation that was put in place well over 100 years ago, to look at the needs of crofting today and what it has to offer and how you could manage it effectively and devise an entirely new administrative structure around that. And I would also, which is perhaps even less popular with a lot of crofters, I would put the responsibility for that in the hands of crofters themselves. Now, it's easy for me to sit here and say these things. It's much, much, much more difficult for anyone in government or anyone indeed in crofting to do that or anything approximating to that.
What would happen if crofting were to disappear?
I think it's possible that crofting could disappear. It won't disappear overnight. It'll kind of atrophy and fade away rather than vanish suddenly. I think, if you take a very long view, you could argue that perhaps ultimately that doesn't matter very much. There were very viable and successful Highland communities before crofting was devised at the beginning of the 19th century. And you could have very successful, flourishing communities without crofting in the what are today the crofting areas. However, I think it would be a pity all the same. In the programme, Brian Wilson, I think, made very strongly the case for crofting as a way of retaining people in localities where otherwise there might be far fewer people, and also as a way of combining, as it were, a bit of agricultural activity and with a home around that with other activities. And I think there is, to many people, there's a real attraction in that, and perhaps in some ways it's a more attractive lifestyle now than it was in the past.
Jim Hunter, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.